For many, the existence of the soul is taken for granted. For Christians, the soul is the form of the body, the seat of the intellect and the will, the image and likeness of God, that which corresponds most closely with angelic nature and therefore spiritual divine nature. It is through the soul that God communicates his grace to us, and it is the soul that gives us hope of life everlasting. Our immortal, rational souls separate us from the animals, and so we speak often of the soul. But there are skeptics who ask for proof of the soul. Give me empirical evidence, they say. For them, the soul is nothing more than a pious fairy tale, something to give us comfort, to help us to not face up to the harsh, brutal realities of life. But what if there were proof? What if there were longitudinal studies carried out over years by universities, by doctors, by scientists, with their studies published in peer-reviewed journals? There does exist such proofs. In a 1982 Gallup survey, approximately 8 million adults in the United States had had a near-death experience. Of those who suffered from cardiac arrest, anywhere from 9 to 18% of adults reported a near-death experience, and an amazing 85% of children reported near-death experiences. For those who report near-death experiences, there are some common characteristics, and some of these are unique to those who experience these near-death phenomenon. These include out-of-body experience, accurate visual and auditory perception, feelings of peace and painlessness, light phenomena, meaning an encounter with a loving white light, a kind of life review. Some report being in another world, encountering other beings, a tunnel experience, and even precognition. In fact, a study has been carried out about those who are blind or seeing impaired. Many of these reported, quote-unquote, seeing for the first time. And for those who did not report seeing, one man said, "I don't know what you mean by seeing, but I experienced something different." For those who have near-death experiences, there seems to be a transphysical component. The transphysical component of a person having a near-death experience may be described as follows. When a person undergoes clinical death, a transphysical component of that person leaves the physical body, frequently through a tunnel, emerging outside the physical body and frequently looking down upon it. This transphysical component is completely intact without the physical body, and it is self-conscious and capable of seeing and hearing without the biological organs. This transphysical component retains all its memories and appears to have acute recall and memory functions without use of the brain. It is aware of itself and its identity and its distinction from others, but it is more than self-consciousness. It has a remnant of its former embodiment, particularly the presence and sense of extendedness. Though it is not physical, constituted by and subject to the laws of physics, it is like an ethereal remnant of the physical body. It is not limited by physical laws such as gravity or the restrictions imposed by physical mass such as walls or roofs. It can be called into a spiritual or heavenly domain in which it can encounter spiritual beings like itself in human form, as well as holy transcendent beings greater than itself, such as a loving white light. It can communicate with these beings without the use of voice and sounds. Though it has autonomy and self-identity, it does not have control over most dimensions of the out-of-body experience. For example, it is moved outside of its body, transported to a transphysical domain, and called back into its body by some higher transphysical power, in order to distinguish it from its former physical manifestation. This is why we call it a transphysical component. Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon and professor at the University of Virginia Medical School, underwent a severe coma from encephalitis and was monitored throughout his comatose state. He described his experience as follows. My synapses, the spaces between the neurons of the brain that support the electrochemical activity that makes the brain function, were not simply compromised during my experience. They were stopped. Only isolated pockets of deep cortical neurons were still sputtering, but no broad networks capable of generating anything like what we call consciousness. The E. coli bacteria that flooded my brain during my illness made sure of that. My doctors have told me that according to all the brain tests they were doing, there was no way that any of the functions, including vision, hearing, emotion, memory, language, or logic, could possibly have been intact. Given what we know about clinical death and these repeated descriptions of the transphysical component, many scientists agree that we have to modify contemporary views of the origin of consciousness. Currently, consciousness is presumed to originate with brain functioning. But if the thousands of monitored cases of clinical death are accurate, and Alexander's and others' assessments of the absence and/or reduction of brain function are correct, and the verifiable reports of consciousness during clinical death are also accurate, then it seems highly unlikely that consciousness originates with the brain. I quote again from Eben Alexander. Brain activity and consciousness are indeed profoundly tied up with one another, but that does not mean that those bonds can't be loosened or even cut completely. The question of questions is whether the deep parallelism between brain function and human consciousness means that the brain actually produces consciousness. In the wake of my experiences, during my week in a coma, my answer is a very confident no. Many scientists who study consciousness would agree with me that, in fact, the hard problem of consciousness is probably the one question facing modern science that is arguably forever beyond our knowing, at least in terms of a physicalist model of how the brain might create consciousness. In fact, they would agree that the problem is so profound that we don't even know how to phrase a scientific question addressing it. But if we must decide which produces which, modern physics is pushing us in precisely the opposite direction, suggesting that it is consciousness that is primary and matter secondary. This presentation quotes directly from Science, Medicine, and Near-Death Experiences by Robert J. Spitzer of the Society of Jesus, and can be found at the Magis Center of Reason and Faith. A link is included below. Thank you for watching.